Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another CARS Reading Skills workshop as part of your Jack Westin MCAT podcast. In episodes like these, we are joined by Jack Westin himself, and we will be walking through a CARS passage sentence by sentence to really help you guys figure out how we should be reading passages in CARS. So this passage that we'll look at today is a Jack Westin daily passage from November 5th. Called Student Learning. And you can find this on our homepage at jackwestin.com if you're hearing this episode on November 5th itself. Or if you're listening on a later date, you could always check the link in the description. It's always great to take a look at the passage ahead of time so that you're really primed to hear and engage with the breakdown that we've got. But you're also welcome to just hop in and listen. This passage in particular is pretty fun, especially as teachers. Jack, we were just talking about this.
Right.
It's fun to talk about how students learn. I feel like we talk about that all the time.
Right. I think we're gonna probably dive into a conversation around this while
I
we're
know.
reading
I
it.
know.
But I think the most important thing is come in with an empty slate, like pretending you don't know anything about the topic, and just listen to the author, right? So I'm excited to do that.
Yes, absolutely. So again, we're going to go through the passage itself, sentence by sentence. We'll make sure that you guys are comfortable with what we should be understanding from each sentence, and then talk about, with each paragraph, what was the main point that we need to understand. So this should set a really solid foundation for the questions, right? And we encourage you guys to try the questions after this as well. So let's hop in with our first sentence. And it says, to assume that our students share our enthusiasm for student-centered learning, that is, learning activities like group work or student presentations or peer review, is tempting. Okay, so again, we're definitely talking about student learning. It's the name of the passage, but student-centered learning. We've defined it, right? So it's things that really focus on student engagement, make the student kind of in the center of the learning. And we're saying it's tempting to think that students want this. To
Yeah,
say it's tempting, I'm wondering, do students actually want this? It's
right.
tempting to assume, but I don't know yet.
Yeah, so we don't know, right? We don't know, and also you're right. They did define it. You may perceive student-centered learning as something else, but the author has made it very clear what it is. It's group activity work, right? Student presentation, peer review. I hated that stuff in school. I thought that was such a waste of time. I never learned in a group setting. So maybe the author's going to talk about it and talk about how great it is. Who knows? We don't really know, but we don't know if that's something students like or not. So that's where we're at, and let's keep going and see where it goes.
Yeah. Okay, so however, Marshall Gregory, E.D. Hirsch Jr., and Edmund J. Hansen and James A. Stevens all question its efficacy in the current educational climate. Okay, so we got a however. So it's tempting to assume that students like it. However, we're questioning whether it's effective. Okay, we're questioning its efficacy. I also want to note this giant list of names.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And like the author is like, hey, you might think that students like it, but this person, this person, this person, and this person all think that that's not true. So the author clearly is providing a lot of support for this. They're not really expanding on each individual person's individual perspective, but they've given us a whole list of people who agree that this might not be effective.
Right.
So that's a pretty important sentence to keep in mind. There's some doubt on whether that student-centered learning is effective.
But what happened to the whole tempting part
You
where they
know.
talked about students being interested in this or not? Like they completely changed gears. And they can
Yeah.
do that with the contrast word. We don't know the answer to the first part of the first sentence of this paragraph, and we'll never know, right? Like at least from this point of view, the author's trying to say we don't care about whether or not students like it. We just know that it might not be the most effective way to learn, right? That's
Mhm.
what the author cares more about. You always focus on the part that is after the contrast word. That is more important to the author. And like you said, there's a huge list of names. And if you're in one of our programs, you know we like to keep track of names and who says what. But here there's literally, I think, 4 or 5 names. So like, what do you do? Do you write all of them down? Well, we always recommend that you keep track of it on paper, by writing down the last name of the individual or highlighting the names, right? Unless they do emphasize one of the names, like it could happen where they'll mention all these names, but then only one of them reappears. Then I just focus on the one that keeps reappearing. But for now, I would keep going, see where this goes. But if it doesn't change, I'd just highlight these names and keep track of where it was.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, typically if we get multiple, you can also use the first initial, or like there's two H's, there's a Hirsch and a Hansen, HI and HA. If you wanted to keep track of them,
Right. Yeah.
you could also just, abbreviate the names, if you wanted to. But yeah, totally. You could highlight it. You could do whatever you want with it. Well, let's keep reading and we'll see if we focus on any of these individuals. We got, yeah, 4 in that sentence. Okay, next sentence says Hirsch cites several studies in which, quote, a significant number of students were more receptive to traditional methods of teaching, like a lecture, end quote. So here we are focusing on Hirsch, and what we're saying is it sounds like students prefer traditional teaching methods. And we didn't like go into extreme depth on a definition of traditional methods, but we did say like a lecture. And that sounds very not student-centered. So it sounds like, we're kind of calling back to our first sentence. It's tempting to assume we prefer student-centered learning. Here we're saying, hey, significant number of students actually prefer traditional methods.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because the second sentence was all about the effectiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is all about the preference.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not talking about the same thing anymore. We're talking about a whole new idea. And this idea is supported by just Hirsch, not necessarily Hirsch, Gregory, Hansen, and Stevens. It's just Hirsch. So
Mm-hmm.
I keep track of who's supporting what, right? So the idea I would the okay, I mean we'll wait until we finish, but I'll kind of summarize what we should do so far. Keep track of the idea that came after the contrast word. Know that all these people were citing this idea that maybe it's not effective, right? This idea of student-centered learning is not effective. And then this other idea, which is that students prefer traditional learning methods. And that idea is supported by only Hirsch. Okay.
Nice. Yeah, that's a perfect summary. Okay, one last sentence in this paragraph. We'll see if anything changes. His interpretation of student receptivity, though not necessarily of the learning that took place, might not be surprising in light of other discussions of student attitudes. So we're basically saying what we just said is not that surprising, or it might not be that surprising. I feel like the first sentence we were saying it's tempting to assume that students like this. And ever since, we've been kind of throwing shade at student-centered learning. Like it may not be effective, students may not even like it, and it shouldn't be surprising that students may not like it as much. So I think we've kind of figured out how the author is spinning this, at least in P1, right? Possibly not effective and possibly not even preferred by students, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think we really got a ton of new info in this. I think the summary that you've already done still stands.
Yeah. Just know, and I always say keep track of these ideas, right? So
Mhm.
just know it's not effective, at least from these people's point of view. And that's not the author's point of view. The author hasn't said what he or she believes, right? They're just citing other people. So student-centered learning is not effective, and students prefer traditional learning methods. Just keep track of those ideas, keep track of who said it, and it's in paragraph 1.
Perfect. All right, well, let's look at paragraph 2. It says Gregory and Hansen and Stevens cite a number of social factors that contribute to students' resistance to the intellectual work of student-centered learning. Okay, so we had said that students prefer traditional learning methods. Now we're specifically explaining why. Why are we resistant to student-centered learning? It has something to do with social factors. So we're bringing up 3 out of 4 of our original people, and we're expanding on why we don't respond well to, or we don't prefer to student-centered learning.
That's right.
I'm curious what these social factors are.
Yeah, but I know I'm anticipating it to be a list, and a list is not something I'd keep track of. I internalize it, and if you're in our program, you'll know visualization is very important. Visualize what those are, but just knowing that they're social factors, that you can group them into social factors, is probably the best way to recognize this idea. Okay.
Yes. Okay. They suggest that society's emphasis on success, instant gratification, the retail consumer model of education, and paradoxically, student-centered approaches to learning lead students to look for easy answers and to count on high grades, to avoid difficult work, and to develop inflated perceptions of their abilities. So it's this sort of social expectation that it sounds like, to be very generous in summarizing, it sounds like we're expecting it to be easy, right? Like, why is it not easy? I don't want to do work. Just hand me my grade, right? Like student-centered learning sounds like a lot of work. I would rather not. Again, it's the sort of social expectations that create this resistance to student-centered learning.
It's interesting. How do they associate avoiding like difficult work to social factors? That's like the confusing part of this paragraph,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, it's the emphasis on success and instant gratification. I think to that helps. It's like you're supposed to be successful, but also we train people to look for instant gratification, which if you're listening to this, you're probably an MCAT student. You probably are not exclusive to instant gratification, but medicine is such a delayed gratification thing, but as a society, that's what we highlight, right? Some of
Yeah,
these are social factors, and
yeah,
to the author, this impacts what kind of learning methods we prefer.
yeah. And it even says student-centered approaches to learning lead students to look for easy answers, right?
Hmm.
And so these social factors essentially create this way of students approaching for easiness, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of grouped in together. It's
Hmm.
not the clearest paragraph. It's not. I mean, it's a very short paragraph for what they're trying to explain, but it gets the job done,
Yeah.
right? We kind of understand what this is saying. We know that students don't. They resist student learning, student-centered learning. That's I think what's going on here,
Yeah. Totally agree.
and it's due to these social factors, right? Social expectations, social factors make students resist students
Yes.
learning.
Yeah. I mean, our very first sentence, we're like, hey, it's tempting to assume that we all like this. No, we've torn that idea apart, basically. They resist it. We know why now. Okay, let's look at our third paragraph. Gregory warns that teaching to students' comfort levels, quote, has become so much the norm that students expect it. So we teach to students' comfort levels, and that's expected. So we're not maybe we're not challenging them. We're just trying to keep them comfortable. Um, this quote continues, so maybe we can finish the quote and then we'll reflect. Um, it says, when students today, for example, think that a given teacher is requiring too much work or grades too hard or assigns boring readings, they take it as a student right to make these judgments about the teacher. Wow, this is pretty intense, huh, Jack?
Deep. How do you go into a student's mind and think about this,
I
right?
know.
Right.
Yeah. So you expect that teachers are going to teach to your level. And I'm saying you as a student, right? Like you expect this. And also, if they don't, judge them, right? It's basically society is giving us a free pass to make judgments about the teacher. This is pretty wild to read.
Right.
I hope that's not the case. Um, but this is what Gregory is warning. And again, we do, like you mentioned earlier, we should tie this to the person or people that are like associated with this idea. So this has all been Gregory so far in this paragraph. Okay, one last sentence. It says, furthermore, and by the way, this is still the quote. This whole thing has been a quote. Furthermore, students with an unconscious assumption of their status as the court of final authority believe that they can judge categorically and unequivocally. Okay, I feel like this last piece is maybe a little bit harder to understand, but if the student is the court of final authority, they're judging the teacher. Same thing as we said before. So pretty harsh, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's all quotes from Gregory.
Hmm.
So even though the author is putting this on the paper, right? We don't know the author's point of view yet. It's
Yeah,
not clear. This is all citing other people. Now, someone might say, well, if this isn't the author's point, why would they bring it up? Because if they don't bring it up and then they make a claim against it, then they don't seem reasonable, right? You seem more reasonable when you bring up the
the
people's
counterpoint.
names that you don't necessarily agree with, just to make yourself seem more non-biased, right? More impartial. And so we don't know really where the author is going with this. At least not yet. The author hasn't said my belief or we believe or I believe. Um, and maybe the author won't, right? And if the author doesn't, then we can just assume it's the author's agreement is with whatever they keep bringing up over and over again, right?
Hmm.
But so far, like what's the big picture of this paragraph? Like what do you need to know? I mean, one is students expect teachers to teach to students' comfort levels, and then the other one is this idea that students think they can judge teachers, right?
Yeah.
And those are big ideas that come up in this paragraph.
Hmm.
Are they related to the last paragraph? Kind of, right? The social expectations, right? Like they have these expectations that make them resist student learning. Like they don't think they need to study it, or they avoid difficult work. And so they don't really end up doing the student-centered learning for one reason or another. Kind of diving deeper into it, but it's not directly linking it. It's right. I
Hmm.
mean, it's sort of a separate entity where they're just talking about how students expect teachers to act.
Yeah.
But it's probably related, right? We could probably link it.
Yeah. It seems like our situation in P2 was like a commentary on how society shapes students and what how that impacts the classroom, whereas this is like much more micro level, like what's going on in the classroom, not what's going
Yeah.
on in society. It's like this is specifically how students engage with their teachers, basically.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
right, it's like it's the same thing but on different scales, and I do think it's worth keeping in mind this sort of smaller scale of the interaction between students and teachers on a kind of micro classroom level.
I love that. I love how you're like, they're zooming in on this one aspect, right?
Mhm.
But the whole thing has been about student-centered learning. And
Yes.
so are they going to go back to student-centered learning in the next paragraph? Like, how does this relate to student-centered learning? Is this just expanding on the social factors? Like, is that what's happening in this paragraph? Because that's what I'm sensing. But
Yeah.
yeah, okay. It's just interesting to when you read, you have to think about how the author is navigating us. Like, where is the author taking us? That helps
Mhm.
us understand the central point of view, the main idea, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right, let's take a look at our fourth paragraph. It says, similarly, Hansen and Stevens suggest that students have, quote, low tolerances for challenge, end quote, and that they, as well as some faculty members, have become risk averse in the classroom because of social expectations. And then we get a list, but social expectations, it does kind of sound like our idea of resistance because of social expectations. I think you're right. We might be coming back to that idea from P2. Educational consumerism, institutional focus on assessment, and discomfort in dealing with diversity issues in the classroom. So it sounds like students and possibly some teachers are navigating this difficult social layer to student-centered learning. It's not just even the students, right? Faculty members too. It's change social expectations are changing what's going on in the classroom, basically.
Right. Right. Okay.
Okay, for student-centered learning to be effective, these scholars recommend that teachers and students reassess the ethos and ethics of learning in higher education.
There you go.
Yeah,
Yeah, student-centered
there we
it goes
go.
back to student-centered learning, which we
Yes.
were expecting, right? this paragraph is basically a summary of the second paragraph. It's exactly the same thing, except they've given us more details in the third paragraph to kind of like talk about it, right?
Mhm.
So now I know my main idea. I like you noticed it, Molly. Social expectations, right? That's just
Yeah.
another way of saying social factors, which were expanded on in the third paragraph, right? And so this whole thing, this whole passage, I don't even have to read the rest. I already know what this passage is about. I mean, I will always read the whole thing, okay? But but we now know what the main idea is because this idea is repeating from paragraph 2 and 4, and they've expanded it in paragraph 3, right? Which is that these social factors, these social expectations make students resist student-centered learning. They don't end up doing student-centered learning because of these social expectations of, hey, I don't need to be graded harshly or things like of that nature, right? Where they think that it's normal to be comfortable. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, but I would still read because there might be unique ideas that change or alter this idea, or there might be unique ideas that are just separate from this idea that they may ask questions about. So I'd still read the last two paragraphs, 100%.
Yeah, for sure. Always read. And it's cool. You're learning about the author, right? Why not?
Right.
Let's look at paragraph 5. It says, but, oh gosh, there's our contrast word. But are our students really unwilling to engage in complex academic tasks, or are some simply unready to do so? Okay, so it's a question of why are we resisting? Is it because we don't want to do it, or is it because we aren't ready to do it? Right? This might be preparing us to add another layer. Okay, we're asking a question. We need the author to answer their own question. But when they do that, when they pose a question to their audience, they want you to think about it for a moment so that you are primed to pay attention to when they answer it for you. Okay, so whenever they give you a hypothetical question, they know that this is words on a page. You obviously cannot answer them. There's no, short answer section where you add your own opinion. They want you though to ponder it so that you are receptive to what they're going to tell you. So in this way, we're kind of analyzing the resistance. Why do we resist on a deeper level? The other thing that I want to point out here, and this is actually not the first time that we've used the word our, but I feel like in this sentence, we get a little bit of information about the author, possibly. We're saying, are our students really unwilling to engage? It's not totally clear cut, but it sounds like maybe the author could be a teacher or some sort of educator. It could be hypothetical. Maybe it's a parent and they're talking about like our students, like my kids are also students. Who knows? But that our students, the author is putting themselves into this story and us, right? Like collaboratively, they're involved, they
Yeah.
care.
Yeah.
They're saying our students, right? So they have like a vested interest in this argument beyond the fact that they're simply writing about it, right? Clearly, the author cares about what's going on. That's just a fun little clue. Like it makes me think maybe this is a teacher that's writing it.
Yeah. Very good point. And it kind of brings the author's perspective into it a little bit.
Yeah.
The author is now kind of associating with what they're talking about. So,
Yes.
okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see if we answer a question about unwilling versus unready. Okay. In a study for the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education, John Immerwahr reported that, quote, the most serious problem facing higher education, according to leaders responding to our survey, is that too many students are not sufficiently prepared academically to receive a higher education, end quote. So our question was, are they unwilling or are they unready? It sounds like, according to this John Immerwahr, um, it sounds like we're not ready. We're not sufficiently prepared. We're not ready for higher education. So it's kind of calling into question, are we resistant because we just don't like it? Or are we resisting because we're not ready for it? It's a new
Regardless,
layer.
yeah, regardless, the author still believes, right? Because they've repeated it multiple times that they are resistant
Oh, for sure. Yes.
and that it's probably not effective because they're resistant. But
Mhm.
but why are they not resistant? Like you said, is being questioned. And I mean, just reading that first sentence, even though it is a question, why would they ask this question if they didn't care
Yeah.
about it, right? Like we could
It's a
probably
pointed question for sure.
it's a pointed question, meaning that they want you to go towards this other way of looking at it, right? Which is that they're not necessarily unwilling, they're just not ready. And this kind of expands on it with Immer War. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. And students may not be the only ones in the room whose preparation is insufficient for university coursework. You see a semicolon, but the last little part says teachers may be unready as well. So students are unready. Okay. Now we're saying teachers may also be unready. Okay. This is an extra layer of the argument. Again, we have already accepted that we're resisting. We're talking about why students aren't ready and teachers aren't ready. So now we're probably going to go off on a slight little offshoot about teachers, but no one's ready for this. That's kind of what we're saying, students or teachers, which is super interesting.
Right. And it's interesting because this is not a quote. This part is not a quote. So maybe this is the author's point, right?
Mhm.
It's the author introducing this idea and supporting the idea. But let's keep reading and see.
Yeah. Hansen and Stevens report that university classes still rely heavily on the lecture and other teacher centered, content focused approaches, while teacher training is often highly theoretical and more focused on student centered learning. Okay, so this helps us understand. Okay, so Hansen and Stevens are kind of involved in this argument that teachers are also not ready, and they're helping us understand why by providing context. So the teachers aren't trained in how they will be teaching, right? They're trained in student-centered learning, but they're expected to do traditional methods, is basically the idea. Um, so it's helping us understand why teachers aren't ready. There's something going on with their training and their expectations. But again, no one's ready.
Yeah.
Hansen and Stevens agree with us. These people are not ready. All right, we've got one last sentence in this fifth paragraph. If we fix this training and social expectations do not change, however, nothing will improve. We're back on social expectations and social factors. So
Okay.
to me, this sentence is saying the training, although it's important and it's, teachers aren't ready for it, it's not more important than social expectations.
Right. Right. It's so interesting because the whole thing is about how, people resist or students resist this student-centered learning. And it could be because of the the students not being ready or the teachers not being ready. But really, what's more important? It's the social expectations. We need to change those. That seems to be the bigger emphasis,
Yeah.
right? So they're going back to the main idea. They're going back to what centrally the author cares about. The author still cares about readiness of the teacher, of the student, but not as much as the social expectation part of it.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool.
Very interesting. All right. Paragraph 6 um, starts with Pamela L. Grossman, Peter Smagorinsky, and Sheila Valencia, focusing primarily on K-12 pre-service language arts teachers. Note that they struggle with the disparity between the theorized pedagogy of their methods courses and the practices they encounter during student teaching. Okay, this is a super, super long sentence. We're about to start a quote. It sounds like we're talking about conflict between training and how they're actually supposed to work. Okay, so it's like possibly the unreadiness part of the teachers. Okay, then the quote begins. It says, pre-service teachers are, in many programs, exposed to textbooks and methods that follow a student-centered agenda, and that includes instruction that is experimental, learner-centered, and activity-oriented, interconnected, and constructivist. So again, they're trained in a student-centered way. Okay. Again, we kind of hit at this in the paragraph before. The fact that they're unready is because they're being trained in the wrong way. We haven't officially said that they aren't expected to use that, but personally, I'm expecting that to come. The quote is still going. There's one more sentence in the quote. So let's see if they kind of finish that thought. It says, however, observational studies of schools show that the practice of teaching in most schools remains much as it has always been: content-oriented, teacher-centered, authoritarian, mimetic, and recitative. So yeah, we're training them in student-centered learning, but we're expecting them to carry out traditional teaching methods. It's just, again, really reinforcing why teachers aren't ready.
Exactly. Exactly. So we're emphasizing teachers again, which is weird because we were taught like the last sentence of the previous paragraph was all about social expectations. And now we're not talking about social expectations. We're going back to teachers and how they are trained and what where we're expecting from them. So I wasn't expecting that, but these authors can write whatever way they want.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like we're bouncing around a fair amount. The ideas have been pretty consistent, but we're taking a lot of little turns in our
Right.
passage. But they have the right to do that. Again, I like to think like in a medical career, you're going to have all kinds of patients, patients that are going to talk your ear off, which of course we still love as providers, but you'll also have patients that you can't get to talk at all. You'll have patients that jump around. You'll have patients that will tell you every detail exactly in order as if they're all equally important. Like these are people that wrote this. They have the right to talk however they want to. So you just gotta go with the flow, even when they bounce around like they're doing in this passage. Okay, last sentence of paragraph 6 here. It just says new teachers of first year college courses face a similar predicament. So again, the take home from P6, we initially brought this up in P5, but if it didn't jump out then, it should jump out now. We're talking about how teachers are trained to teach student-centered learning, and yet they're expected to teach in traditional methods. So again, they're not ready. The teachers are not ready to do this. And that can, contribute to this resistance that we talked about and kind of why maybe student-centered learning hasn't been as effective as we mentioned in P1. And this is Grossman. There's a bunch of people. Again, Jack, you suggested you could highlight if you want the names of the people. We've got another list here: Grossman, Smagorinsky, and Valencia. Seems like the author likes to name drop people.
Yeah, you could also just mention Grossman et al., right? And that
Mhm.
means like, more people, right? So that's okay too. Yeah, but big ideas here. I think the part that says teachers are in many programs exposed to textbooks and methods that follow a student-centered agenda. That I think that's really important to keep track of. And then this other idea that has a contrast word, right? However, observational studies of schools show that the practice of teaching it in most schools remains much as it has always been, and it keeps going into this kind of like standard traditional route of teaching. So big ideas, teachers trained to teach student-centered, but then teachers really teach old methods, right? And both are supported by Grossman.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, last paragraph, and P7 is just a single sentence. So let's see how we finish this off. It says, when we fail to adequately consider misalignments between our students' social expectations, ding, ding, there's our word again, student-centered approaches can be no more effective than the teacher-centered approaches, no matter which style we choose to use. So if we don't fix social expectations, nothing else matters. It's basically the take home. Jack, you called it halfway through. You're like, wait a minute, we've repeated this a couple times. This idea of the social expectations and the social factors is going to be really important. Yeah, we've come back to it, what, in 4? It's been in 4 out of 7 of the paragraphs. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, and the thing is, there was another idea that was new that was brought up after this, right? This idea of teacher training, and teacher training is off, right? Like they're
Yeah.
training them in certain ways that don't correlate with what they actually do. They need to fix that, right? But
Hmm.
the author is saying, okay, even though that is a problem, there's a bigger problem,
Yeah.
right? And so I would say both of them are technically main ideas, but one is definitely more important than the other, right?
Yes.
Because they do mention teacher training in the fifth paragraph. They mention teacher training in the sixth paragraph. So that's technically, if it repeats in more than one paragraph, it's part of your main idea. But the author is making it very clear, I care about social expectations more, right?
Yes.
And so if I had to pick, I'd say, okay, yeah, we have to realize that social expectations are what's really making people resist or students resist student-centered learning, but also student-centered learning is suffering because of the way we're training or getting our teachers ready.
Yeah.
Seems to also be a big point as well.
Yeah. What you just said is so, so profoundly important. Like the author can have multiple important ideas, right? Like the author can have multiple layers to their main idea, right? They could have multiple main ideas, but you should always figure out and decide before you move on to the questions, which one is the primary, right? Like what is your main idea? If you get a question, what is the main idea? And both of the things that you found to be main ideas were options, which one takes precedent? Right? Like the social expectation seems to be the most important, but that doesn't mean that teacher training is not also a main idea that was repeated, right? So like that I think is nuance that is so helpful for students that are learning how to navigate cars. Like, well, what happens if there are multiple things that are brought up all over the place? That's fine, right? You can have multiple layers to your main idea, but it is helpful. Make a decision. What is the primary main idea? Okay, like which one wins out? Which one is the most supported? Which one does the author feel, or do you feel like the author cares about the most? And with that hierarchy, right, when you go to the questions, you have everything that you need to succeed, right? And of course, now that we've walked through this, that's exactly what we would recommend you do. There are 7 questions associated with this passage. And so you've got 7 opportunities to test how well you understood what you read and how well are understanding the key points of the author, which is great data to collect on yourself, especially you've listened to this episode, you've heard us walk through what was most important from each of these paragraphs. You're ready to get a lot of valuable learning about yourself and your car's tendencies here in these questions.
Great. I love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. This was a really fun passage to read, especially with you, Jack. We've both been teaching for way too long, years and years and years. So it's super interesting to read passages like this on student learning. And I'm excited for our next one, as always. Definitely for all of us that are listening, definitely try our questions. And if you like this, come back and see our next one, right? We do cars reading skills workshops every single week. So we hope to see you again soon in another episode. Until then, happy studying. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And bye, everyone.